Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video. PvP Season 36 is starting soon, so it's time I gave you guys an updated ranked tier list on all 36 specializations. I've divided the tiers from S to F, S being the best and F being the worst, so let's get right into it. Core Guardian, I'm going to go ahead and put this one in A. It's still a fantastic support, it's got great defensive value, you can't really go wrong when picking a support guard in a ranked match, unless you're going up against a lot of boon rip. So if you're up against stuff like Core Necro or Thief, it might be difficult to play a Core Guardian, but otherwise, it's fantastic overall. Dragon Hunter. It got some good buffs in the most recent balance patch, but overall, I don't think it's doing that great at the moment as a ranked carry. It's just too squishy. There's a lot of damage and survivability in the current meta, and Dragon Hunter is very difficult to play if you're constantly getting bursted or chased down. I am hesitant to put this any higher than C. I would say overall, it's probably low C, high D. Now, Firebrand is really bad at the moment. It wasn't doing great before, but the changes to the tome skills definitely did not do any favors for the spec. So overall, I'm going to go ahead and put this one in your trolling tier. Now, Willbender is also not doing great at the moment. I would really love to play more Willbender, but it needs a second charge in the F2 back so that it's more self-sufficient. But as of right now, Willbender still deals a ton of damage, but the survivability just isn't really there. I'm going to go ahead and put this one at D. Now, Core Warrior is still a strong side noter, just not into any of the meta specs. So Core Warrior is also D tier. I'm not going to put this in your trolling because this can do a good job in certain 1v1 matchups. Now, Berserker got a lot of buffs lately, and it's actually pretty solid in 1v1s and team fights. It doesn't really have any roamer builds unless you go for a rifle spec with Gunflame, but I think Berserker is actually B tier right now. I think it's pretty solid, especially like the hammer builds. You can CC chain people, you have good value in your 1v1s, and in team fights you can just lock people down forever. Spellbreaker, still the best 1v1er at the moment. I'm gonna put this one in A though, because I don't think it is the best spec. It is just very strong and you do need to be good at it, but if you do know how to take your 1v1 matchups, Spellbreaker can definitely carry matches. You can win all of your 1v1s and survive your outnumbered fights, which is great. So defense, Spellbreaker is definitely pretty high up. Their strength is a little bit lower just because there's so many blinds right now that you need resistance on dodge from the defense trait line to really land your damage. Bladesworn, it's pretty bad at the moment. It wasn't doing too great before this patch, but it got nerfed even more. So this one's on the low end of D for sure. I don't want to put it in your trolling because these specs you should never play in PvP if you want any sort of success or fun, but the D tier is going to be the ones that you probably should stay away from, but I mean, you can play it if you really want to. Now, Core Rev also goes in D. It's just a worse version of Renegade, and Renegade's not too great at the moment either. Power Herald is still solid overall as a ranked carry, but it is a win more spec. So if your team's winning, you'll win faster with the Heralds, but if you start to fall behind, Herald doesn't have the 1v1 potential or outnumbered potential that some other specs have. So if you start to fall behind, it's hard to come back as a Herald. With that being said, Condi Herald is also not doing too great at the moment. I think Condi Vindicator is better overall. Now, as for Renegade, this spec is also just doesn't really do much at the moment, and there's so much projectile denial in the meta from Ellie's that it's really difficult to land any of your damage from short bow. I would say Bladesworn is definitely like the worst out of this bunch, but Renegade isn't doing too hot at the moment either. Now, as for Vindicator, damage Vindy, dealing power damage is still pretty good. It hits really hard, still got great active sustain through all the evades and blocks, but it doesn't have a lot of resustain in terms of healing unless you go Condi Vindicator, which I've been having fun on lately. Condi Vind is pretty solid as a 1v1er, and it's good in team fights as well. Alliance Stance kind of gives you that healing that you lack if you were to go Condi Herald instead. I would say it's the high end of C or low end of B, but overall I've been having a ton of fun playing Condi Vindicator, so it's definitely worth trying if you are interested in this spec. Now, Core Ranger, it's not doing too great at the moment. It's a weaker version of Druid, so wherever Core Ranger goes on this, Druid is going to be higher. Because Core Ranger is a side noter and not a roamer, it also tends to go lower on the list because any spec that deals a ton of damage with a lot of mobility and can run around the map quickly and pick up a bunch of kills generally tends to be a stronger ranked carry, and this is a ranked tier list. So I'm going to go ahead and put Core Ranger in D. You can still do well, but you're not going to win 1v1s into pretty much any of the meta specs at the moment. Now, as for Druid actually feels pretty good right now. Definitely not meta, but you can get a lot of value out of it. It's an all-rounder. I would say it's the high end of C or low end of B for ranked. It's kind of a toss-up between these two. As an all-rounder, you can run around and pick up kills, so it makes me want to lean towards B more. But yeah, we'll just leave it here for now, and then we'll see if I switch it around later. Now, as for Soul Beast, one wolf pack builds are always a gimmick, so it will do well in lower ratings, but it always falls off once you start going up against better players. So it can really go, I would say in C, it's pretty solidly C. Now, Untamed got a lot worse after the last patch. The nerf to Unnatural Traversal with the quarter-second cast time being added onto it really killed the roamer playstyle of the class. It still has a ton of damage, but in terms of the amount of value you can get out of an Untamed, it is a lot lower without the port for sure. I honestly feel that Druid is higher impact than Untamed right now, if you play Druid correctly. Untamed is definitely high end of C, low end of B, but yeah, we'll just leave it there for now. Now, Core Thief. This spec is underperforming right now. I mean, it's still a thief, so you still have a ton of mobility. You can run around and pick up decaps, and you still have good damage if you go deadly arts and or crit strikes. But overall, there are better thief specs at the moment, so I'm gonna leave Core Thief in D. There's probably gonna be a lot of specs that end up in this tier at the moment. Now, Daredevil is pretty solid at the moment. I don't think it is the best carry spec for ranked, but it can do quite well if you know how to play it. I'm going to put this one in low B or high C. I mean, crit strikes Daredevil deals a ton of damage, but I guess it's matchup dependent as well. If you're going up against Sikkim Soul Beast or anything that can reveal you like a Tools Hollow, it's going to be exceptionally hard to play Daredevil, and I'd probably drop it down to tier or 2. But if you're not up against anything that reveals you all the time or can jump on you and burst you, then I would say Daredevil is pretty decent at the moment. Now, this might be a controversial opinion, but I believe that Deadeye is the best thief spec for PvP as long as you're not going up against anything with a ton of projectile denials or reflects. Unfortunately, Ellie is meta at the moment with both Tempests and Catalysts, and there's a ton of Weavers at the moment as well. So it is very difficult to find a match to play Deadeye in. However, if you're not going up against anything that can stop your usage of rifle, I feel like Deadeye is solidly B tier. It could maybe go up to A if you can hard farm the enemy team, just because the reset mechanic on the steel is quite strong. But right now, overall, I would say Deadeye is probably C just because of how many reflects are in the meta. Now, Spectre is still decent. It has a lot of mobility, it has decent damage, but the survivability really isn't there with the nerfs to the Shroud pool. So I would say that Spectre is probably high end of D or low C, but I'm gonna go ahead and leave this one at D. I think there are other thief specs like Daredevil and Deadeye that can be more effective than Spectre more consistently. Now, Core NG, you're trolling. I don't really think I have to explain it. This spec just doesn't really do much. Now, as for Scrapper's been kind of popping off lately. There's been a lot of pretty solid damage specs. You can definitely meme kill a lot of people with Stealth Gyro. You stun them and grenades, and then if you land grenade barrage or shrapnel grenades on someone, you deal 12,000 damage to them. So Scrapper is pretty solid as a ranked carry, but it also only runs one stun break, so it is very risky and also matchup dependent. If you're up against a lot of stuff with good stun breaks and also good crowd control, it's going to be very difficult to play Scrapper. Otherwise, I would say it's definitely low end of B, high end of C for ranked. Now, as for Hollow, I would say it probably falls into the same boat as Scrapper. Both these specs are pretty decent at the moment for just carrying your ranked matches. They both have a lot of damage, a lot of ways to set up your damage as well. Tools Hollow is very effective against any stealth-based class. So if you're running the Tool Straight Line with the lock-on trait, you're going to be a menace to anything that wants to turn invisible. And then Nade Hollow is just very consistent. Nades are the best mid-range weapon set in the game. So if you're running Nade Hollow and you know how to land your nades, this spec is going to feel pretty good. And also, the Condi Clear is actually pretty solid on the spec now with the changes to the Hollow heal skill. Now, Mechanist is pretty bad at the moment. It is an entirely projectile-based class, whether you run rifle or pistol, but there's just so many Ellies in the meta at the moment that it's basically impossible to play Mechanist if you're up against any of those specs, whether it's Tempest or Kata or Weaver, just because you're not going to be able to hit anything. In fact, you'll probably be shooting yourself in the face more often than you'll actually be hitting your opponent. So if you're up against any Ellies or anything with projectile denial, Mechanist is definitely F tier because you're trolling. You actually won't be able to deal damage in the match, but if you're not, I would say it's probably the low end of D. Now, if you're lower rated, maybe in low gold or below, I would say Mechanist could maybe move up to C just because it does deal good damage from range, but aside from that, this spec is definitely not great at the moment. Now, Core Necro. This is not doing great at the moment either. You can play Fearmancer with some success, so I would say it's definitely the high end of D or the low end of C. We'll just leave that one there for now. Now, as for Reaper, Reaper's still a great team fighter. It's still got a ton of AoE damage. I would say for ranked, since it has pretty good stun breaks right now with the weakness shout on a 20-second cooldown and spectral armor on a 30-second cooldown, you can stay alive. And I've been having a lot of fun playing Greatsword Reaper with the blind well utility as well as the AoE blind well from Greatsword 4. So I'm gonna go ahead and put Reaper at C. It's also matchup dependent, but overall I do think you can do quite well if you can play Reaper in ranked. Scourge is definitely underperforming at the moment. Doesn't really do that much, but you can still corrupt a lot of boons and give your teammates barrier. I would say Scourge probably gets more value if you're lower rated, just because people will stand in the AoEs and won't know how to wait out the barrier you provide before bursting. Now, Harbinger is very difficult to play at the moment as well, because it's again a projectile based class and there's a ton of allies at the moment. So if you're up against a lot of builds with Reflex, it is very difficult to play Harbinger. But if you're not, I would say Harb is probably high end of D or low end of C again. Core Ellie, you're trolling if you play it. You can make a Signet build work with conditions, but overall it's not great. Now, Tempest is the best support at the moment. It's always good into everything, and Staff Tempest is potentially harder to kill than Dagger Focus Tempest now with the buffs to Staff. So Tempest definitely S tier. It's a staple in the meta. Everyone's running Tempest. If you have a Tempest on your team, you'll have a much stronger team fight than if you didn't have a Tempest. Now, as for Weaver, Weaver's got a ton of builds. Ellie probably has the most viable builds at the moment that you can play very comfortably in Plat. You have everything from Fresh Air Weaver to Lightning Rod Weaver to Fire Weaver. So I'm going to go ahead and put Weaver in C. I would say mid to high C. It really depends on what the enemy team is running, but if you know how to counter swap to the correct builds on Weaver, you can definitely counter certain builds on the enemy team, or just play something like Fresh Air if nothing threatens you and just run around one-shotting people. Now, Catalyst is still amazing right now, even with the nerfs to Scepter, with the loss of a charge on Blinding Flash and Water Trident, and the cooldown increase to Jade Spheres. Kata is still completely dominating. It is a fantastic spec, amazing and competitive, amazing and ranked as well. Fresh Air is fantastic, and then Hammer also is still a great side nutter. So Catalyst still S tier. Now, Core Mesmer definitely underperforming. You can do decent if you play either a bunker build and go in side node with Staff, or you can play a burst build as well and do decent on Mesmer, but there are definitely a lot better options if you want to just run around, kill people, or side node. Now, Chrono is doing quite well at the moment with its well builds. I would say it's probably mid B. If you play Power Chrono and you are very good at the spec, Power Chrono is very impactful. You can just one-shot everyone and it's hard for them to do much about it. Now, Mirage definitely underperforming. With one dodge, it's just really easy to kill Mirages at the moment. So everything from like Power Lock to the power builds, Mirage is just very solidly D tier. Now, I have found a very good hybrid Vert build that I've been having a ton of fun playing, so I will go ahead and put Vert in, I would say, the high end of C or low end of B. I actually think you can do very well on Vert right now because there's so many Ellies and your blade songs are unblockable. You can just shoot through all their reflects. So if you're up against like a Catalyst, for example, or even a Fresh Air Weaver, running the hybrid build or any sort of Condi Vert build, if you confusion burst them at the right time or even land a full confusion burst on them, it's either going to kill them or pressure them very significantly. So I'm pretty tempted to put Vert in mid B. It's also just exceptionally hard to kill right now, even if you're not running Inspiration or Chaos. So yeah, that's the updated tier list for season 36. Again, this is tentative, but from my experience in the past week or two of unranked, this would be how I value all of the different specs at the moment. And again, keep in mind, this is for ranked, not tournament play. So roamer specs tend to do better in ranked just because they can run around and pick up kills. All rounders tend to get a lot of value as well if they have high damage output, and any specs that counter the most frequently played builds are also going to be higher on the list, with anything that the more common builds counter being lower on the list. If you enjoyed the video, like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.